talking about the effects of elevated cortisol on the brain. And cortisol either could be exogenous because someone's taking cortisone, or someone has just high production of cortisol. Okay, but cortisol itself can thin the blood-brain barrier. It can break down the gut barrier. That's one key thing. Extensive cortisol use and high cortisol levels can atrophy the brain.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Witten, and today I have with me a very special guest who is an award-winning researcher, academic professor, and functional medicine healthcare provider, Dr. Datis Kharrazian. A little bit of background on him. He specializes in developing evidence-based models to treat autoimmune, neurological, and unidentified chronic diseases with non-pharmaceutical applications such as diet, nutrition, and lifestyle medicine. His academic and clinical research has been featured in numerous documentaries, and his clinical models of functional medicine are used by several academic institutions and thousands of healthcare providers throughout the world. Dr. Kharrazian has received appointments as an associate clinical professor at Loma University School of Medicine, a research fellow at Harvard Medical School, and a research fellow at the Department of Neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital. And this is just a very, very summarized version of a very long list of impressive accomplishments. So thank you so much, Dr. Kharrazian, for joining me. Such a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks, Ari. Nice to be here.
Yeah. So today we are going to be talking about the role of the brain in chronic fatigue. And I want to kind of give a little bit of an overview of some stuff that maybe listeners of my podcast have heard before, and I'm sure that you're pretty familiar with, and kind of give that overview and then get your take on this. So I've had a number of different guests on the podcast who have talked about brain function as it relates to fatigue through a number of different angles. And from what I can tell, a lot of people have kind of their pet theories and their personal take on what they think is sort of the dominant factor. So Ashok Gupta is very focused on limbic system dysfunction and the role of that in chronic fatigue syndrome, and kind of a focus on psychological, emotional stress as being the central factor that results in limbic system dysfunction. There's another chronic fatigue syndrome researcher named Raymond Perrin out of the UK, who's very focused on the glymphatic system of the brain and lymphatic drainage and kind of blockages of that, and then toxins accumulating in the brain. There's also Alex Vasquez, who kind of focuses on the gut and leaky gut and dysbiosis resulting in neuroinflammation and excitotoxicity, but kind of seeing the gut as more primary and the brain as secondary. There's people who have more of a neurotransmitter focus. There's people who have more of a childhood trauma focus or a belief and sort of negative thought and belief focus. But there's also people who have more of a sympathetic system versus parasympathetic and vagal tone sort of approach. So with all of that said, and kind of all of these different angles of talking about brain health as it relates to chronic fatigue or energy enhancement, I'm curious what your take is within all of that context.
I think, I'll be honest, I'm not as familiar with all those areas of different theories as you are. I'm kind of in my own little world, and so I don't know. But I can just tell you, if you do a complete neurological exam, and I can give an example, a complete neurological exam takes me about 2.5 hours to do. They do comprehensive lab work. You quickly identify if it's limbic or if it's gut brain, if it's a basic ganglia, if it's frontal, if it's autonomic dystonia. I mean, all things are not one thing, right? So my impression as a clinician, and not knowing what anyone else is doing, is you can't even have a theory about the brain unless you first know how to evaluate it and work it up, and then you actually do that. We live in the world where there's so many theories about everything, and then at the end of the day, it's kind of like the exam findings present themselves. So a limbic presentation or an autonomic dystonia presentation or a clear history of a gut-brain relationship or looking at vagal function during the exam, those are all things you can do. So you don't even have to have theories for it. So, but that's one part of it. So I think, at the end of the day, when people have brain-related issues, it's not that hard to figure out. You just have to work it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what kinds of specific dysfunction do you think are I guess, the most common sorts of dysfunction that you see in people with, let's say, chronic fatigue?
So I think for me as a clinician, when I see a patient that comes in, it's really common to see so many patients when you ask them to list their chief complaints in order of what's bothering or impacting their life the most. I mean, fatigue, chronic fatigue is really a very common chief complaint. But whenever I see chronic fatigue, my first question to them is, do you have fatigue just throughout the day, or do you have fatigue when you use your brain? So I'll give an example. Brain-based fatigue happens when you use your brain. So they'll say, I'm really tired after I drive. If I'm on the computer for an hour, I fatigue. That's a brain-based fatigue mechanism. Or someone else, and depending on what part of the brain is not functioning well. So if someone has like a frontal cortex that's unhealthy, if they are focused on attention and concentration for a period of time, and it's very easy for them to have low endurance in those pathways and fatigue. If someone has like a cerebellar issue of the brain that's degenerating or not healthy, like standing all day or just standing for 20 or 30 minutes can really exhaust them for the whole day. And so it can have a global effect on the brain. But when you look at fatigue and you kind of break it down simply just as a way to understand it from a brain model versus a metabolic model, metabolic fatigue happens all the time. It happens for no reason. It's just there. Brain-based fatigue happens when you use your brain. So a lot of times when patients really think about it, sometimes their fatigue really isn't adrenal, and it's not anemia, and it's not metabolic, and it's not thyroid, it's not a hidden infection, it's not a chemical toxicity, it's just their brain is not healthy. And that's one of the key symptoms. So the first sign of neurodegeneration in the way the brain works is as it starts to degenerate and fail, one of the earliest symptoms is low endurance of the brain, and then that presents as fatigue. So when your brain shuts down, everything shuts down. So when your brain shuts down, you don't want to move, you don't want to do anything, you don't want to have any stimulation for the brain, you just want to be left alone. Mm-hmm. So that's really the pattern of brain-based fatigue. Now, what I also notice as a clinician is when people come in with fatigue, how they get treated really depends on where they go. So just like we talked about different theories of the brain, I mean, that's not uncommon with practitioners. Practitioners, there's a Lyme doc, there's the adrenal doc, there's the chemical toxicity doctor, and that's kind of the lens they see it through. And I think one of the biggest mistakes clinicians can ever make is when they just accept one model. And what's interesting is working with practitioners and teaching and being on the road for over 20 years, and getting to see all different variations of how people practice. What I've noticed is most practitioners kind of pick what they do because of their own experience with it. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, if I see a Lyme doc, I pretty much know in their history they probably had Lyme. Yeah. A doctor who's like asked to treat their adrenals, they probably had a good experience treating their adrenals and they felt better. And then they kind of see the world that way. So right. You've probably seen the same thing.
Yes, definitely. Yes. I also think that there's this really unique kind of fascinating and unfortunate psychological tendency that humans have where we tend to always try to reduce things down to the one thing. Yeah. And I think just we're psychologically wired to say, once we start, let's say, getting some results with an adrenal supplement, we're like, oh, it's adrenal fatigue and it's all about the adrenals. And then our brain just goes that way and we kind of dig our trench and say, this is my position and this is what I think it's all about.
Exactly.
So I really appreciate what you're saying here, that we need to have a much broader and more encompassing perspective that looks at all of the different pieces of the puzzle and how they fit together.
So let me give you some further insight into that as a clinician. So when you work with patients that are chronic and they're suffering from fatigue and they've got a whole list of issues. First of all, if they're suffering from fatigue, that means at the end of the day, they lost their physiological ability to make ATP. Right? So that's the final common pathway, is they can't make ATP. Whether it's a mitochondrial defect, whether it's not getting enough fuel, whether it's oxidative stress, whether it's a hormonal issue, whether it's a chemical issue, they're all up for grabs. They're all ready to play. Now, when you have long-term mechanisms that cause fatigue, you do have insult or lack of function of the mitochondria, right? But the biggest effect of that we really see on the brain, and the brain is one of the early signs of where this happens, because the brain has what's called post-mitotic tissue. Once you develop cells there, you don't develop new cells. There's some new research being done with neurogenesis and things like that, but they have very limited expressions, and we don't really, make more neurons than what we really get when we're born. So when people have various mechanisms causing it, there sometimes tends to be an effect on the brain, and everything else gets treated besides the brain. So brain health is really a key factor, I think, for a lot of people to have fatigue, and not really focusing on how to recover their brain function is overlooked area with chronic fatigue issues. So I think if you're a person searching for your cause of fatigue, or if you're a clinician working with practitioners, one of the easiest questions to ask is, if you have fatigue, is it all the time? Which is more of like a metabolic type of thing? Does it come and go? Or does it have after meals? Does it have after some event? But if it's very specific to, if I read a chapter, I'm done. If I try to do this activity, I'm finished.
Okay.
Those are pretty straightforward brain-related fatigue mechanisms.
Okay, so let's dig into brain-related fatigue specifically.
Sure.
And I assume that's very much intertwined with brain fog. Those two things kind of go together, do they not? Or how do they? Where do they differentiate?
So brain fog is they go together. Brain fog is typically it takes place when neurons are not synapsing properly. So neurons communicate with each other through a synapse message. Certain things can slow that communication down. So one of the major things is inflammation. Inflammation can impact how efficiently neurons synapse together. And as the synaptic rate slows down, people can't find words, people can't focus, people can't do the tasks they normally do, or it takes them longer to get there. And many people explain that as brain fatigue. So whenever we hear brain fatigue, we tend to think that there could be an inflammatory component to it. But they don't always overlap. So sometimes people just don't even have that connection with brain fog. They just lose their function and get really, really tired and don't really have that as part of the component. Now, one of the earliest signs of brain fatigue is actually neurodegeneration. So, you don't just develop Parkinson's, you don't just develop dementia. So let's talk about dementia, which is really prevalent. It's really common, something that we're all at risk for as we get older.
I just want to quickly interrupt. So you said one of the biggest signs of brain fatigue is neurodegeneration. Is it, or neurodegeneration is brain fatigue?
Yeah, let me clarify that. I'm sorry. So one of the first things we see with early neurodegeneration is brain fatigue.
Gotcha.
Okay, thank you. So I think when people understand is when they start to have their brain health compromised, they start to lose their brain endurance. And as they lose their brain endurance, they get tired. And when they get tired, they start to look for other things that are causing it. For example, let's just stick with the adrenal glands. Oh, my adrenal glands are so wiped out. I got to take adrenal support, and I got to take adaptogens. And maybe they do, and maybe they don't. And maybe they do, and it gives them a little boost. And maybe they do it and has no effect. There still could be an underlying neurodegenerative process. And supporting the adrenals may not be what they need to do. They may need to get in there and aggressively support the brain health and make a difference that way. So it's one of the most commonly overlooked things when we see patients that have fatigue. They don't think that the brain's a part of it. And then quite honestly, when you look at the field of healthcare professionals practicing, whether it's MDs or DOs or DCs or NDs or family nurse practitioners or nutritionists or dietitians, they're not really trained in how to find early brain degeneration. They don't even consider it a possibility. They wait for a person to have tremors, or they wait for a person to completely lose their way home or not remember family member names before they even go down that clinical route. But many, many, many people start to have early signs of neurodegeneration, especially in their 30s and 40s, and each decade the risk goes up. And that then causes their endurance and their neurological pathways to be compromised. And then they try to use their brain doing their everyday tasks. That exhausts them. Then they search from one practitioner to the next, trying to find something for their fatigue. And they waste a lot of time. And at the end of the day, they don't realize that they really have a neurodegenerative process that's being overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So once you differentiate between, let's say, brain-based fatigue versus more metabolic fatigue,
yeah.
How does that then influence the sequence of how you go about looking for the underlying causes of that? So I guess to phrase this differently, what does the picture of underlying root causes look like for brain-based fatigue versus more metabolic fatigue? And I know that's a very complex answer that you could probably spend 5 hours answering, but if you could kind of summarize maybe where they differ in terms of some of the root causes.
Sure. So if we see, let me put it to this way. So in a clinical setting, if we come to the scenario, a person walks in the door, they say, I'm fatigued, I'm exhausted. And then we do some further questioning and we find out their fatigue is really maybe more brain-based because it tends to happen when they use their brain. Then the next clinical question, which I think you're asking, is what do we do and where we go from there and how we find the causes, right? Mm-hmm. So once we determine it's brain-based fatigue, the next question is where in the brain is it? So different regions of the brain have different functions. So if it's focused attention and concentration, then we know it's the frontal lobe. it's memory and recall, then we know it's medial temporal lobe. If it's related to things like balance and coordination, exercise and movement that really fatigue them when they try to do it, then we know it's the cerebellum. Let's just stick with those three for now, okay? Now, if it's like long-term memory and recall, that's one of the early signs of dementia. If it's more, in some dementias, are frontal temporal. So if their focus, attention, concentration are also being impaired, then we know that could be an early sign of dementia too. So that kind of helps us to see where we are. And then certain conditions, like the two most common neurodegenerative diseases you always have to rule out when you hear people have brain-based endurance issues is it dementia or is it Parkinson's? So when we see brain-based fatigue, the first thing we try to rule out is dementia. And if it is memory and recall, and if it is getting worse, and they have a family history of it, their risk significantly goes up, okay? And what people don't realize is that dementia and Alzheimer's goes in a progressive scale. So it doesn't just happen overnight. So it starts with not being able to find your keys and your phone numbers or your phone or whatever the things are that you normally recall. We don't recall phone numbers much anymore because we have these great apps, but it could be just directions. It could be the next level of impairment. And then it gets to the point where they function goes down in daily life. So things take longer to do. They're less, they can't be on time as well as they used to. People around them, family members, coworkers start to notice that. That's when their function gets impaired. And then from there, it starts to just progress. That's a red flag. That is a serious issue. And that something you should know is in those early stages, if you get a complete neurological exam, you still have a normal neurological exam. But there's no findings for dementia on an exam. It shows up with clinical presentation. Now, if we talk about the other neurodegenerative disease, that's the second most common, is Parkinson's. Once you start to see brain endurance issues and fatigue that is brain-based, you always throw out Parkinson's. And the first sign of Parkinson's disease is actually loss of gastrointestinal motility. Mm. So Parkinson's, what you get is what are called protein aggregates, alpha-synuclein aggregates. They build up in the brain, but they build up in the gut nervous system first. So when people start to get brain-based fatigue patterns, we want to make sure they have healthy motility. And then from there, they get slowness and stiffness. So if someone comes in and says, I'm exhausted and I'm tired, we go, okay. And then we find out that the fatigue is always worse when they use their brain. Now we know it's brain-based fatigue. Now we see that they're taking 50 supplements to treat a bad gut and they don't have normal bowel movements and their GI tract is not functioning well. And then in the clinical exam, we see they have stiffness or they complain about shoulder stiffness or hip tightness, which is the most common thing. The movements are a little bit slower. That is early Parkinson's. Mm. That's the early pattern. So as soon as we hear that a person has fatigue and we find that it's brain-based, the initial first step is to go, is this a neurodegenerative disease? So we always start from worse, then go down to less aggressive. And then if it's not a neurodegenerative pattern, many times the brain is fatigued just because it's not getting what it needs. The brain needs oxygen and the brain needs glucose. So then we go down to the very basics and go, do they have a blood sugar issue? And then the next clue for us to see if they have a blood sugar issue is how do they feel after they eat. A normal response is when you eat a meal, the only thing that should happen is you're no longer hungry. Any change of energy is a sign of a blood sugar problem. So if a person has low blood sugar throughout the day and they eat, they usually feel better and their function comes back. So if we say someone clinically states that, hey, I feel better after I eat, then we go, wow, you probably have low blood sugar throughout the day. Because that's not normal. Normal is you just get hungry and then you eat and there's no change in function. And then people that have high blood sugar, insulin resistance patterns, they eat and they get tired. And then, so we kind of immediately can look at that as the reason why the brain may not be functioning well because not getting proper glucose to the brain. So
you get tired after eating.
Yeah. So a third of the body's glucose is used by the brain. I mean, if there's any shift, any slight abnormalities in your blood sugar stability, your brain will feel it. Okay. Now, these types of mechanisms are important too because they enhance and promote neurodegeneration. So if you have an underlying blood sugar issue that's part of your brain-based fatigue, you are definitely dealing with a risk factor to develop a neurodegenerative disease. The other thing is sometimes people have poor brain function, like they just have poor endurance. They have anemias or they have poor circulation. They have things that impact them. They have an underlying asthma or a respiratory issue that's never really been managed well. And sometimes we have to correct those things clinically to make a difference. Just yesterday, I had a very interesting case. I had a patient that came in. She was a 36-year-old female, and her biggest complaints was her brain doesn't work. She can't focus and she can't concentrate. Very intelligent, but she barely made it through college despite her intelligence. And then when we examined her, she basically had thalassemia, which is a genetic disorder where the red blood cells break down. She had a mitral valve prolapse. She doesn't have proper ejection fractions, and she had really bad circulation, and she had a raging hypoglycemia pattern. She dismissed meals throughout the day. Like, all those things have really dampened her brain function, and she's tired all the time. But those things, so now we're trying to put on antioxidants and different things to help with the thalassemia, and then trying to do things to improve her circulation naturally with things that activate endothelial nitric oxide. And we're trying to get her to stabilize her blood sugar, and then we want to see if that changes her brain function and her overall energy throughout the day. And that is a case that is not uncommon, things like that.
Interesting. So you mentioned a couple factors: blood sugar regulation issues, and then getting oxygen to the brain,
right.
As far as circulatory issues.
Yeah.
Obviously, if somebody has mitral valve issues or thalassemia, those are, I would say, very big issues, and probably not necessarily that common, I would imagine. So what are, well, I guess we can address these in a stepwise fashion, but let's say somebody who has low blood sugar, what are some of the most common root causes of why somebody's going to err more on the side of hypoglycemia?
Low blood sugar, hypoglycemia. Okay. So the most common cause someone has low blood sugar hypoglycemia is, first of all, just lifestyle. They just don't eat. They forget to eat. Mm-hmm. And then when they eat, they just eat sugar. They're not the junk food, fast food diet people. They're the ones that will wake up and have like tea in their honey, and that's about it. And then when it's time to eat, they'll have like fruit. Mm-hmm. That's the typical hypoglycemic pattern. And over time, their adrenal glands exhausted. That's one way. So whenever we see a low blood sugar pattern, the first question is it caused by their lifestyle, or is it caused by a physiological thing? But the most common cause is that it's caused by lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And then that type of lifestyle where they're constantly missing meals or having high sugary foods for a meal, like they're having a fruit smoothie for a meal, and very little protein or fat or fiber in their diet, that's going to cause a functional low blood sugar pattern, hypoglycemia.
Okay.
And then that eventually taxes the adrenal glands. Other times, people may have their adrenal glands completely depleted from infections, from stress, from other things. And then their adrenal glands really lose the ability to make adequate cortisol. So they have a hard time getting the blood sugar stable. Now, there's a really easy way to tell the difference clinically. Patients that have adrenal gland exhaustion that end up with low blood sugar, they usually come in and they say, man, I have to eat protein every 2 or 3 hours. I don't function. They're just trying to survive, and they have to eat that way to get through the day. People that have reactive hypoglycemia patterns from lifestyle, they're like, I just don't know why I'm so tired. I don't know why I feel bad. I don't know why I've lost my menstrual cycles. I don't know what's going on. And it's like, well, tell me what you eat. Well, I eat really healthy. We're like, great. And then they go through the organic list of fruits and and all the things they do throughout the day, and they don't understand that that's not healthy for them. Mm-hmm. So those are the two typical patterns we see with low blood sugar.
Now, are those really that different, or have they just found one type of people have found the sort of way of coping with it by eating protein every 2 to 3 hours?
Well, let me explain. If you choose to eat protein every 2 or 3 hours, that's different than having to eat 2 to 3 protein every 2 hours to make it through the day. Mm-hmm. The people who have really got to the point where their physiology is so compromised where they have to eat every 2 to 3 hours are the ones that really have a physiological mechanism why they're hypoglycemic. Mm-hmm. The person that chooses to, for various reasons, that's different. But the person that has to do it to get through the day is usually a low adrenal, a person who has low adrenal function causing hypoglycemia. The most common thing, though, is a person whose lifestyle is causing low blood sugar. Okay.
I would like to dig into that a little bit more. Sure. What do you do in that scenario? Let's say somebody has low cortisol levels and they are one of these people that's eating every 2 to 3 hours,
right?
A high protein snack they need to in order to function. What do you do to try to help that person?
Okay. So let's say we run an adrenal profile. We have a baseline cortisol output throughout the day. So we want to get a baseline and go from there, right? They have to stick with their diet because it helps their adrenal glands have a chance to recover, and that's the only way they can function anyways. Then you can give them adrenal support, but there's something driving that. So the things that drive that could be infections, they could be immune challenges, they could be immune challenges meaning they can have a reaction to the chemicals or environment around them or food proteins they're still consuming. They could have an underlying disease that no one's diagnosed yet. They could have things where even traumatic brain injuries have been shown to sometimes dysregulate the feedback loop systems. So you're kind of going the route of what's the trigger. And sometimes it's just chronic stress. I mean, we can only handle so much stress for a period of time. That's not as common, but sometimes it is for some people. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to look for sources of it, and you can't really supplement your way out of that with adrenal gland support. They can help aid the patient so they can function better, but you can kind of go there. The easiest way to figure out those things is just do a comprehensive blood test. If you see low white blood cells or high white blood cells, you know that you've got kind of immune component. You can look at different T and B cell profiles and see if there's some type of subtle immune type of trigger that's not showing up in the total white blood cell count. You can see if there's any things going on with the liver, diseases or infections or viruses. You can look at, you can look at the thyroid. You can look at basically the entire physiology with a comprehensive blood test. And then that really most times helps narrow it down. And then you kind of go from there.
Gotcha. So one of the other strategies, actually, you know what, before I get there, a real specific question on the cortisol pattern that you're talking about. Are you talking about a very, very overt sort of low cortisol pattern, or are you talking about a subtle dysregulation, maybe a slightly lower morning cortisol awakening response, and then slightly higher evening levels, like a flattened diurnal cortisol curve that's slightly off what's average? Or are you talking about like an overt pattern that's maybe closer to something like Addison's disease?
With Addison's disease, the adrenal salivary cortisol is not a good test for that, because it's not, with Addison's disease, you have to lose at least 60 to 70% of your adrenal gland reserves and tissue to show up, and you have to do a 24-hour urine cortisone test to find that, and that's better diagnosed with adrenal antibodies, 21-hydroxylase antibodies specifically. But in this case, I mean, we're not talking about Addison's, it's pretty rare. But whenever you look at an adrenal cortisol profile, there's different components to it. The output of cortisol throughout the day is a function of the factory, which is the cortisol factory is the adrenal glands. The rhythm itself has nothing to do with the glands. The rhythm is all hippocampus. Mm-hmm. So when you look at the feedback loop, there's feedback loops within the brain, specifically the medial temporal lobe. And in the hippocampus communicates with an area of the hypothalamic area called the periventricular nucleus. And integration through superoptic pathways, through serotonin projections, modulate the effect of these preoptic areas. They activate the periventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus that controls pathways with the circadian rhythm through the hippocampus that controls the cortisol rhythm. So when we see a rhythm problem, it's a brain problem. And many things can impact that. And when we see an adrenal gland itself that's an issue, that's when we see the cortisol output throughout the day that's off. So they've actually done multiple studies now where they look at cortisol rhythms and they use it as a way to determine progression of dementia and Alzheimer's, because the first area in the brain that dementia hits is the hippocampus, which controls this rhythm. So that's another thing. A lot of times when you see this just dysfunctional rhythms, but they're able to make cortisol throughout the day and they have brain fatigue issues, that's another early sign of Alzheimer's or some type of dementia pattern that hits the medial temporal lobe. So the people that have the hypoglycemia issues, though, we're really more concerned about their cortisol output throughout the day. Now, the problem is when the cortisol output is so low throughout the day, they appear like a flat liner, like all the way through. It's just simply because they don't even have the factory to respond to a rhythm. They don't even have the output to respond to a rhythm. Mm-hmm. So the ones we see totally exhausted have that. Now, the ones we see that have rhythm issues, those are really more of a brain-based pattern. They don't respond as well to things like B vitamins and general adrenal glandulars and things like that. They need to be support the hypothalamic areas with things more like adaptogens and things like acetylcholine support, like Kharrazian. They have a better effect.
Gotcha. Just real quick, the reason that I asked is I've reviewed the literature pretty extensively. I've got actually a very long article, almost like a short book, reviewing literally every study that's ever been done on HPA axis function, adrenal function, and cortisol levels in relationship to stress-related exhaustion and burnout syndrome and all the different fatigue syndromes, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. And actually adrenal dysfunction seems to be extraordinarily rare in any of those populations. It seems like the vast majority of people with any of those fatigue syndromes have normal cortisol or very close to normal cortisol levels. So the kind of overt adrenal abnormality that you're describing, I'm sure that it actually exists. I'm not skeptical of that. I'm just saying it seems to be extremely uncommon, at least,
Yep.
or it seems to be just, I guess the only way that it could be there is that it's uncommon enough to be completely sort of removed from the picture when you take the averages of those populations of people with fatigue syndromes.
Well, in the scientific literature arena and endocrinology journals, the whole concept of adrenal exhaustion and fatigue is controversial.
Correct. Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's true. But you have to understand, when you look at the scientific literature and those things as well, you have to understand what are they using as the biomarker to assess them. So if they're looking at serum CRH, cortisol and cortisone, you're not going to find anything. So if that's their study design, that study design is good for what it is, but it's not going to find some of these more of a subtle type reactions, simply because the ranges with them are very, very broad. And that really makes the fact of there's bias into their study and confounding because of the type of method and measurement they're using. So if they're using salivary cortisol profiles, they're using salivary cortisol profiles with various things, and some research, and there really hasn't been a good list of research on these subtle functional what we call functional adrenal type patterns that are there. But there was definitely lots of good studies on rhythms. But to be quite honest, you have to look at what the study design and the interest the question was. You don't have a lot of people looking at low chronic fatigue issues and trying to look at adrenal salivary profiles or publishing on it. That's just a fact. So I've spent a lot of time looking at the literature too, related to stress response and HPA axes. I haven't read all of it because there's, I don't know how many now, 50,000 papers or something. So if you put in stress, there's an enormous amount of paper.
Yeah, certainly on stress, on stress-related exhaustion and burnout specifically.
Yeah,
like fatigue syndrome.
Stress-related exhaustion and burnout is going to be something where you find limited amounts of information for sure. Mm-hmm. But I just think part of it is because we also don't have like the best study designs done, or even the actual studies done. But it's still an area that needs to be researched and investigated. I don't disagree with you.
Gotcha. So one of the other factors that you mentioned as a big factor in brain health is circulation and oxygen delivery to the brain. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the underlying causes that might impair that aspect of things?
Well, we know, some people do have subtle anemias, so we always want to look at a CBC. And then just one of the key factors is poor circulation. So, a lot of times people complain of cold hands, cold feet. So you can just palpate it. You can see it. And, one of the key things people that have poor circulation is they'll notice their best brain function if they exercise and move and their blood flow and circulation come back and the energy is there. So typical thing you see with the patients got like chronic fatigue issues related to lack of blood flow to the brain is when they actually move and they notice that their circulation changes for the next few hours, they have the best amount of energy. And then as their hands and feet get cold again, their energy goes down. So sometimes we'll have patients kind of track their fatigue levels and their brain function symptoms based on how they feel temperature on their hand and feet. And they can actually get a surface thermometer and just kind of measure their hand and feet. And they can kind of compare the temperature in their wrist compared to the temperature in the fingertips. They see like a 10 degree difference. That's usually a sign of poor circulation. And then if you can start to correlate their energy level, like they notice their brain function is great and their energy levels are great, and then they measure their temperature and it's somewhat normal. And then they notice when their function's down, that really helps us as in a clinical window determine like, well, we have to improve your circulation. Mm-hmm. So then we'll maybe consider strategies to improve their circulation, which may be things like vinpocetine, which activates endothelial nitric oxide synthase. That's a really fantastic way to get improved circulation, butcher's broom, different types of compounds, just in the fact that they can just do some physical exercise and decrease things that impact their adrenaline levels, that could be an issue there. So those are all things that they should do. I'm sure that there are a number of different like overt genetic conditions that might impair circulation, like mitral valve prolapse or something like that. How much of this, the circulatory issues, do you think are more a direct function of nutrition and lifestyle inadequacies? Like somebody's just like mostly sedentary and maybe their heart muscle itself is just not that strong. Well, yeah, so that's a good point. So I would say very few a few cases are related to things like heart disease or things like mitral valve prolapse or some type of pulmonary issue or lung disease. Those are more significant, and those are usually associated with secondary disease. Now, the other things are there's some genetic susceptibilities for some people. I mean, one of the things we know with all the studies being done, the Human Genome Project, and just the genotype, is that there's so much variation between them. We don't know what all the gene SNPs mean, and we don't know what the gene SNPs mean in combination. And I think at this point, the scientific community is at the point where they have to use machine learning to try to interpret all this because there's too many variables to do it. So in a clinical setting, though, behind the science of where the genes really fit in, we know that there's a genotype, and then all you can really do in a clinical setting is try to modulate the phenotype, their genes plus environment, nutrition, and lifestyle. So when you see someone come in and they tell you, well, everyone, their sisters, their mom, their grandmother, they all have really cold hands and feet, and they always get cold, there's probably some type of genetic uniqueness that impacts various receptor pathways. But at the end of the day, those things can be one of the reasons why they're not functioning as well as they can. If they can change those things, it can be a factor. Sedentary lifestyle is for sure one of the most common ones for poor circulation. And some people are prone to things like hypothyroidism and various things. But I think as a clinician and as a patient suffering through it, you just kind of have to go through and figure all those things out and find the best way you can change the expression of your genes to make a difference, right?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple specific questions on that. One, are you aware of any other sort of common lifestyle factor other than exercise that has a strong effect on circulatory function?
Lifestyle factor, sedentary lifestyle and physically active is the single most common factor. Okay? That is without question. The other part of it could be, well, like we just talked about, some of the genetic variations we don't totally understand and why some people have issues there. Like we see people who work out all the time, but everyone in their family has cold hands and cold feet and the circulation's poor. And if we can do things to change the expression of that, then they do better. But they always have that vulnerability. Outside of basic sedentary lifestyle and movement and genes, I'm not really sure of anything that comes to mind that is a key factor there.
I always wondered, just the fact that we're living such indoor lives now, and we have so much less exposure to just infrared rays from sunlight, from just spending time outdoors. Mm-hmm. I always just kind of thought that might have a big impact on things because, I might, in the middle of my house, I might feel cold in the winter, and, it might be as simple as going outdoors and just getting some rays of sun on my skin, and all of a sudden I no longer have cold hands and feet. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And every person's unique to themselves, and you have to kind of dig through all that and figure out the best strategy. So
stress. I know that a couple of the big factors, I have your Save Your Brain program, and I've gone through that extensively. So stress and sleep are a couple of the other big factors that you go into in that program.
Yes.
How does stress affect the brain? And I know that's very broad, and there's lots of different factors, but just kind of a broad overview of what stress does to our brains.
So to make it very simple, long-term chronic stress has several effects. One of them is and this is really related to, if we be specific, to the cortisol shift. Okay, so if cortisol goes up, is the key factor. So some people can adapt to stress, some people can't adapt to stress. But if we're really talking about it, let's just be specific. We're talking about the effects of elevated cortisol on the brain. And cortisol either could be exogenous because someone's taking cortisone, or someone has just high production of cortisol. Okay, but cortisol itself can thin the blood-brain barrier. It can break down the gut barrier. That's one key thing. Extensive cortisol use and high cortisol levels can atrophy the brain. And when you look at the brain, the hippocampus, which you talked about earlier, which controls the circadian rhythms, it is loaded with cortisol receptor sites. And because of that, it's most sensitive to cortisol. So high chronic exposure to cortisol tends to have a degenerative effect there. And so those are the key things that we know about the brain. So can impair and promote degeneration overall throughout the brain, but the most sensitive area is the hippocampus, the medial temporal lobe for long-term memory recall, and the blood-brain barrier being breached, and just global atrophy to the brain are all associated with high cortisol.
So that's sort of the primary thing that stress is doing to our brain. Is there any issue of sort of, I guess, over time decreasing vagal tone or rewiring the limbic system into hypersensitivity?
Right.
Kind of like the limbic kindling theory and kind of this hyper excitatory state of the limbic system?
Okay, so the limbic system and the medial temporal lobe are different, and they have different responses. So the adrenal glands makes cortisol, aldosterone, and epinephrine, right? Different types of pathways. The effects of cortisol in the brain are different than the effects of epinephrine or norepinephrine. So the adrenal cortex releases cortisol, but the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine or norepinephrine. The epinephrine or norepinephrine is what hits the limbic system. So when you look at the amygdala and you looked at different areas of the limbic system that are involved with anger and stress and pain and heart rate and autonomic responses, those are all catecholamine-based receptors. So the effects with stress, I mean, for some people they have stress and they release catecholamines, and for some people they have stress and they release cortisol, and for some people they have stress and they have an opioid response and they have a beneficial effects from it. And and this could be some of the things that I think are conflicting with some of the research being stress and looking at cortisol, because there's all these other variable factors. That's why I was answering you this time. I'm using not the word stress as a broad term. I'm going to use the actual chemical pathways itself, which I think is more precise anyways. But yeah, adrenaline and norepinephrine will activate the limbic system. So some people can have, so there's a concept called negative plasticity. And, we think of plasticity is how neurons communicate to each other, and as they branch into each other more efficiently, that's plasticity, right? But if you have pathways activated that have an adverse effect on your health, that's called negative plasticity. So for example, phantom pain is negative plasticity. You get such a severe injury, your arm is cut off, but you still feel your right thumb that's no longer there. It's still burning, okay? And autonomic responses with the limbic system is also PTSD. Those are all considered negative plasticity. So, there's different theories about this from what I understand about it. And if you bombard a region of the brain with a high load of stress, whether it's pain, whether it's injury, whether it's psychological, and you have continued catecholamine elevations, that can auto-activate those centers. Now, I think with a limbic pattern, they're describing what I think a lot of people use in the literature called dysautonomia, where their sympathetic system is kind of firing at their own rate and their resting heart rate's higher, and they may have dilated pupils and they start sweating for no reason, and trivial things like sound or light can increase their heart rate. Those are limbic phenomena. So that could be due to several things. It could be due that they have negative plasticity developed in their limbic system. It could be that they have some gene uniqueness where they're extremely sensitive to catecholamines, so they react that way. The limbic area is shut down by an area of the brain called the basic ganglia indirect pathway that shuts that system down. Like I just had a consult and worked up a patient on Monday. He had pandas, he had an infection in his brain. He injured his basic ganglia, and now he can't dampen his thalamus, and his heart rate's up all the time, and he can't handle sensory input, and he has to focus and concentrate on an iPad just to not be sensory bombarded. So that's a basic ganglia pathway. So if we see someone who's got autonomic dystonia, like we'll see with some of these soldiers that have been in combat, or they've had some serious traumatic events, or we'll see with some people that have developed negative plasticity through some kind of sensory bombardment that's been very adverse for them. Other times we'll see it because their basic ganglia is degenerating, or they had an injury to a certain part of the brain. I'm not really sure if I answered your question, but the autonomic dysfunctions are all different.
So where does the vagal nerve underactivity fit in all of this?
Sure. So it's sorry. All right. So the vagus nerve, in the brainstem, we have the vagal motor nuclei, and we have an area called a nucleus ambiguus, and they fire into the gut, and then we have motility and blood flow to our gut and all those things. So majority of the brain's output. So the brain is constantly getting input from all the different receptors we have, like sound, smell, taste, and whatever, gravities, pulling our muscle spindles. They all fire to the brain. Then the brain fires most of its output to the brainstem, which then has our respiratory centers and our digestive centers, and that's how we stay alive. So in the lower parts of the brainstem, we have the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is constantly getting bombarded by the cortex. So when brain function starts to go down, we get decreased output many times to the vagus, and people start to have their digestion and motility impacted. So we know, for example, when kids are born, their brains are not fully developed, they can't digest. And then as their brains develop, they move and they function, they start to be able to digest food, and they're getting neurological activity to the vagus, their gut, and that also starts to develop. But when people start to degenerate at the brain, not just the gut, but because the gut has the nervous system too, but the brain starts to degenerate, you get decreased output. Just like how movement and cognitive function slows down, you also can get slow down function in your output to the brainstem from the brain, and then from the cortex to the brainstem, and then from the vagus nerve to the gut.
Excellent.
So we see that all the time with people that have neurodegenerative changes.
And I know you focus quite a bit, at least with a significant segment of the people you work with, on vagal nerve activation. Can you describe what the benefits of that are, and what are some of the techniques that you use to accomplish that?
Well, we only do that with people that actually have impairment. So let me kind of take a step back. So in a clinical workup, so if I see a patient that come in and they tell me stuff like I can't swallow well, or even more subtly, please don't recommend supplements to me, pills, because I can't really swallow them well. If you can't give me liquids, that's a red flag that their vagus function is not doing well. So the vagus nerve not only controls gastrointestinal motility, but it controls the palatine muscles in the back of the throat, so you can swallow, right? So swallowing is primarily vagal activity. So one of our red flags that someone may have impaired vagus is that they come in with that type of history. Okay, then on an exam, we actually evaluate vagus function. So one of the things we do is just have them say, and look at the palatine muscles. And the palatine muscles should move, and they should be robust and have great activity. When they say, those things should move. Sometimes we don't see much movement there. Then we check their gag reflex, make sure the gag reflex is working. And if those things are not functioning, then we consider the vagus as a problem. But we wouldn't jump to a clinical approach for the vagus unless those things were impaired.
Okay. What are some of the other kind of key signs or symptoms that indicate an impaired vagus activation?
Another vagal issue concern is when you look at gastrointestinal problems, and the gastrointestinal problems are specific to motility, to movement. So a chronic inflamed gut or distension is different than just not having bowel movements. So there's some people that have vagal dysfunctions, like they have to have magnesium or soften their stool to have a movement. They have to take some type of botanical to enhance motility to be able to have a bowel movement. Those are the ones that we're worried about the vagus. But also remember that those are the first signs of Parkinson's disease. Mm-hmm. So Parkinson's disease starts with gastrointestinal motility, and then it's loss of smell, especially to coffee and peppermint and peanut butter. Those are the three known sensitivities. Loss of smells first. Then this goes into stiffness of joints and then rigidity. So we always rule out vagal issues. And now there's some research showing that the buildup of alpha-synuclein, which is later Parkinson, starts in the gut and goes actually up the vagus nerve to the dopaminergic centers in the brain.
Oh, wow.
So vagal issues are always important for us, but when we see them, especially with low motility in the gut, again, we rule out Parkinson's like we talked about. And the thing with Parkinson's too is that there's early onset Parkinson's. People under the age of 30 develop Parkinson's, and it takes decades before they even have any signs of tremor.
I have a very specific kind of personal question on the topic of Parkinson's. This is a bit of a digression, but I'm just curious because you have so much clinical expertise here. My uncle, who's now in his mid-70s, has Parkinson's. He was a highly competitive swimmer growing up for decades, actually well into old age. He's continued to compete, but he was a very, very high level competitive swimmer at Harvard, and then, in various games, athletic games. But I always thought that the chlorine toxicity could have played a role in the neurodegeneration. And I'm just curious if you've seen any relationship with swimming and chlorine exposure.
I don't have any experience with that.
Okay.
But I can tell you some research we've been doing with that related to chemicals. So a paper that we published a couple of years ago in the Journal of Applied Toxicology, we found that chemicals bind to proteins. So when chemicals bind to proteins, they become new antigens. And even though you may not be able to measure chlorine levels in them that are high, if you measure chlorine bound to proteins, like albumin is the most common in the protein, you can find very, very high levels. So first of all, when we published that paper, we were saying the way we're looking at toxic insults may not be the only way of just measuring the level of the chemical. These chemicals bind to proteins that become new structures, and the only way we can find them is with antibodies. We published that a couple of years ago.
Oh, wow.
And then subsequent to that, we then took those patients that had antibodies to chemicals, and we listed a host of chemicals, and we saw which of them had antibodies, and we saw if there was an effect with that. Right now, we're finishing up a manuscript to submit to the Journal of Parkinson's Disease, where we measured BPA bound to protein antibodies, because BPA exposure is common, but not everyone gets Parkinson's. Mm-hmm. So what we found is that people that had BPA bound to protein, BPA bound to albumin, which is the protein antibodies, there was a correlation rate of like 0.9, which is almost 1-to-1.
Wow.
So we're trying to this with the theory of like, maybe the way we're looking at how chemicals impact Parkinson's is more than just what's in that bloodstream. Because you can do a study and measure chlorine levels in the blood of patients and then find nothing.
I mean, I think even also just a basic epidemiological study to see if rates are higher in competitive swimmers versus non-swimmers would be interesting, even though it's not mechanistic and direct, causation.
Yeah, I mean, epidemiology studies would be interesting. Obviously they're always going to get criticized because they don't have a causative role, and they go, so what? And we have our problems with our correlation study too. But you do the best you can. I wouldn't be surprised if chlorine was a factor. Certainly, there's publications between people who work around chemicals, especially oxidized manganese in industrial chemicals, have higher rates of Parkinson's disease development. That's definitely in the literature.
Interesting. Good to know. Well, thank you for that.
Sure.
So I want to be respectful of your time here. My last question to you is brain and gut health. Can you kind of quickly describe the relationship of gut health to the brain and how that might play a role, like how somebody's gut health disturbances might manifest as brain fog or brain-related fatigue?
So, what's interesting is like back in 1990s, 2000 was a decade of the brain. That decade of the brain lasted for like 30 years. And now we have this new big decade as the decade of the gut-brain axis, whereas there's all this funding and research being done to look at these relationships. And a lot of departments are studying it. So lots of new information is coming out all the time, but it's pretty clear now that the gut microbiome has a direct effect on the brain. And there's two types of effects on the brain, what are called canalized pathways and non-canalized pathways. So canalized pathways are actual neurological tracks. So the thing to understand is that the brain is intimately connected anatomically to the gut through the vagus nerve. So I used to teach human brain dissection at Bastyr. One of the things we would do is we would do this extraction of the brain. But in order to extract the brain properly, you cut around it and you pull the brain out. But you have to go behind the neck and do a laminectomy, cut all the spinal canal out, and then you can cut it there and preserve the brainstem and the vagus. And if you do that, you can see the vagus go all the way from the brainstem all the way into the gut, all over the gut. And the vagus is the wandering nerve. It's huge. You can literally take your hands on the gut, follow it all the way up to the brainstem into the brain. Like, it's anatomically connected. So those are canalized pathways. So there's a lot of research, and these pathways are bidirectional. So there are actual chemical signals that go back and forth through the vagus, through the brain and down. Okay. Then there's this whole field of non-canalized connections. Non-canalized means it's not an anatomical pathway, it's just chemicals. So there's a bunch of chemicals that are released that pass the blood-brain barrier unrelated to the vagus and get effects on the brain. These are like neuropeptides and cytokines and different proteins. So there's constant feedback loop between both those systems happening all the time. So there's no separation between these two. And what they're finding is that the microbiome, these bacteria, produce different substances and different peptides and different polysaccharides. And these things have a direct effect on the brain. And the interesting thing that what we know with the microbiome research is they don't really know which bacteria species are bad, but the different bacteria species have different effects on different neurochemical pathways and different functions of the brain. But there is a common agreement that the more diverse the microbiome is, the healthier you are. Mm-hmm. So the more bacteria species you have, the more enzymes you have from these bacteria species to do various things, the more potential you have to be balanced out and attain homeostasis. So to make it very simple, the more diverse your gut is, the healthier you are, and the more diverse your gut is depends upon how diverse your plant fiber foods are in your diet. So if you're eating a diverse list of plant fiber foods, you have a healthy microbiome and you have the best potential for your brain gut axis to function.
Which is a big problem, I think, when you consider I think the numbers are something like the average American has no more than 3 types of vegetables in their diet, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Iceberg lettuce and maybe they're counting potatoes and French fries and potato chips as one category, and maybe tomatoes are technically a fruit, but it's very, very limited in terms of.
And even people that are healthy, they or people that are sick, they'll just find like 3 things to eat every day and have the same salad every day and the same things, and they don't get the diversity they need.
Yeah, I'm sure you saw the Hadza gut study where they looked at. They were kind of expecting to find in the Hadza tribe in Africa
Okay.
They analyzed the gut microbiome of these people, and they were kind of expecting to gain this deep insight into what are the true, good types of bacteria and the bad types, because these people don't seem to have really any of the gut issues and the IBS and the Crohn's and all these things that we have. So they analyzed this, and they were actually shocked to discover that there was an amazing diversity of different microbes, and included lots of different microbes that actually were previously thought to be pathogenic, but they weren't manifesting in any pathogenic way in these Hadza people because of the overall context of their lifestyle, their diet, and just the context of those pathogenic organisms in balance with all the other organisms in there.
Exactly. And I haven't read that study that you pointed out to, but it's a similar theme that they're finding is that there is, this whole version of bad versus good bacteria is really questionable, and how one bacteria species works in combination with other species is another variable onto itself. And
yeah, it's endlessly complex, I think.
It's exciting, and also kind of defeats your excitement too at the same time when you hear how complex it is,
Yeah, absolutely. I think the same thing is going on with the whole the gene SNPs and kind of that whole area of research. But Dr. Kharrazian, thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure. I have one final request for you.
Sure.
I know that you often work with a selection of the population that you're working with very complex cases. If people are ending up in your office, it's because they've probably been to 50 other people and haven't had results, so they're finally ending up in your office.
Right.
And you're dealing with a lot of complex stuff. But for those people who are listening to this interview, who are maybe on the healthier side of the spectrum, who maybe have some mild brain fog, maybe some low energy, but who don't have really serious symptoms or complex illness in any way, what would be your top 3 tips to those people to protect and preserve their brain function and create the healthiest brain possible that is the most resistant to neurodegeneration and neurodegenerative diseases?
The first key thing is healthy relationships. We tend to focus on nutrition and diet and all that stuff, but healthy relationships are the most important. So not having toxic relationships, having an environment where you're healthy in your work, in your home, those are critical. That is absolutely a key factor in any chronic illness, or just to be healthy. It has to be addressed. Sleep is completely overlooked. You have to have sleep. More and more studies show if you're not getting proper sleep, your brain's in trouble. And so healthy relationships, sleep is a great one. Finding something that makes you happy every day, gives you joy, makes you smile is important to have an opioid release throughout the day. And, just things like you're saying, get out there, get some sun, eat a diverse diverse series of plant food in your diet. You can still eat other food, meat and other things if you want, but it's not being vegetarian, but having a diversity of fibers in your diet seems to be critical of what we're learning. And those are like very basic things that we all know. It's just a matter of when we get stuck out of the routine of doing those things or having those things being part of our everyday life, then we get in trouble. And sometimes the answer is so obvious,
Yeah, absolutely. You just reminded me as you were speaking there with your, you earlier in this interview, you went into such amazing complexity, and then I love how you brought it back to a few simple things. But you reminded me of one quote that you had in the Human Longevity Project film that you and I were both featured in. You said something that was so great. I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but it was like something like, most people have this chronic stress. And you know what? Most people just need to get outside and go for a freaking walk for 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you again so much for doing this interview. It was such a pleasure. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I'm sure that people are going to love it and learn a lot from it. Where can people find out more about your work? And also, I know that you have a new product, or maybe a few new products coming out in the near future. If you want to let people know about anything that you have coming out in the near future, feel free.
Everything is in Dr. K News, drknews, news.com. And the only thing we have is I just written a couple of books, one on the brain. We have an online brain program, and I have an office in San Diego. So those are the only things I have to offer to people. But it's all there at that website if you want to check it out.
Excellent. So drknews.com.
Yeah.
And then you have you have a book on Amazon. What's it called? Why is my brain not working?
Why isn't my brain working?
Dr. K, thank you
Great.
again so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Art. Appreciate it.